Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of Accelerating Your Professional Growth. My name is Marley, and I'll be the host for today's Ask Me Anything webinar. With me, you'll find Meghan Reid, who's a career counselor, and Prep's very own Julia Fulton. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions for Julia and Meghan at any point throughout the webinar in the chat, and we'll do our very best to answer as many as we can at the end. Before we get to know a little bit more about Meghan and Julia, we'd like to know a little bit more about you. So on your screen, you'll find a poll, and we'd love for you to fill it out to kind of get to know where you're at in your career journey. So while we have people filling this out, let's learn a little bit about our panel. So Meghan, maybe feel free to start first. Give us a little bio about yourself, who you are, where you're from.
Sure. So I'm getting feedback. I am located in Toronto. I am a psychologist and an entrepreneur. With my career, I specialize in career psychology primarily, and I own Canada Career Counselling. We're the largest group of psychologists that help people with their career challenges in Canada. So that's a little bit about me.
All right, and Julia, what about? I mean, I know you, and I'm sure a lot of people on the webinar already know you, but let's hear a little bit more about you.
Sure, yeah. So I have a background in HR, and in partnership with my co-founder Laura, we really realized there was a huge need to sort of upskill people in the science of career search. And unfortunately, nowhere along our education journey are we really ever taught that there's sort of a proven way or proven science to go about looking for work. And so we're super passionate about everyone sort of achieving the best they can and sort of excelling in their lives. And we really wanted to equip people with this sort of basic knowledge that is sometimes hard to find. And so that was sort of the real inspiration and genesis of Prepped. And just thrilled to be here and looking forward to answering everyone's questions. I know it's a tough career environment right now. So really hoping that we can help provide some insight and guidance for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. So we do have a lot of questions that were submitted in advance. So we're going to go over as many as we can, and then we'll allow about 15 minutes to take questions from the chat. So again, if you are online, you're looking to have a couple questions answered, feel free to type them in. I'll mark them as a question and we'll answer them live. So let's just dive into the questions. First question is for Meghan. So this one is, I have a question about trying to apply for positions where you feel unqualified for, which I feel like a lot of people have been there. I have been there. I do not have professional experience, so I feel like I'm trying to oversell myself, even though I have the prior experience / skill set. How can I sell myself and set myself up for success during the interview process?
So I totally agree with you. I think that is a common question or a common concern that a lot of people have. I think the first piece of advice I would have is to keep in mind that when a job posting is put out there, it's really the employer looking for their ideal candidate, not necessarily who they're going to exactly hire. It really depends what the competition looks like, who else is applying to the job. So I think keep in mind that even if you don't have all of the qualifications on the posting, it's still probably worth applying. For example, if it said, they want a candidate who has 5 to 7 years of marketing experience, and you've got 4 years or 3 years, I mean, I still might apply. If you have 0 marketing experience, it's probably a little too far out of your threshold. So I think it's understanding that there can be a stretch. Second thing I'd say, if you don't have professional experience, that's totally okay. What you need to do is think about where you do have relevant and related experience that demonstrates the skills or the qualities that the posting is speaking about. So that could come from personal experiences, volunteer experiences, internships or co-ops, school, things like that. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is kind of own the fact that you don't have that professional experience. So probably one of the things that comes up the most for some of the clients that I work with is they're trying to avoid discussing gaps in their resume, like if they don't have professional experience or if they haven't been working for a few years. And I would say be confident about it. If you're a new grad and you don't have that professional work experience, to say, I'm recently graduating, I don't have professional work experience yet. My experience primarily comes from volunteer and co-op. Okay, of course, that's fine. So I think it's not trying to hide it and just addressing it directly if it comes up.
The one thing I'd add too, oh, sorry, Marley, you did look like you were on mute, but the one thing I wanted to add specifically for our female audience right now, there's many studies that demonstrate that women are more likely to underestimate their capabilities and are often less inclined to apply to positions if they don't meet like 100% of the criteria. So I just would also want to kind of advocate that it's really important that you sort of stretch yourself, and you don't have to, as was already shared, you don't have to be the absolute perfect candidate, but take a chance and take a risk, and know that you're capable beyond maybe what you're believing yourself to be.
Good point.
I love that. Yeah, the next question is around resume tips and interviews. So Julia, feel free to pipe in on this one. I have applied to hundreds of jobs with no luck of getting any interviews. I feel like I'm doing something wrong with my resume. What are your top resume tips? Should I submit a resume in a Word or PDF format or any other format?
Okay, I'm so glad this person asked this question, because in general, I see a huge overestimate on how important a resume is and how much time people obsess over resumes. It's very concerning for me, because resumes are actually sort of a nice to have, necessary thing to have, but they're not sort of the primary channel to go about looking for work. So one thing I want to make sure everyone knows is many companies, especially larger companies that receive a high volume of applicants, rely on a technology called an applicant tracking system. And essentially, this is a tool that companies use to try and quickly sift through a lot of resumes at one shot. And so essentially what it's doing is it's looking at keywords that come up in the job posting and then matching it to the resumes they get. And so, if you're customizing your resume to match some of the keywords in the job search, you're more likely to get through the ATS. But 80% of resumes get rejected within 11 seconds. And so if you're just sitting on your computer, hitting easy apply on LinkedIn and applying to hundreds and hundreds of jobs, that's fine and good and necessary, but there's actually much more effective ways of going about looking for work. And I would just say, be sure to check out Prep, because there's a ton of tips, especially in the My Plan section, where you could much better be utilizing your time and sort of working towards job search connections. And I won't go into detail here, but it's all laid out for you, where you can learn much more optimal ways of spending your time than necessarily just applying at mass online with your resume. That being said, specifically for resume tips, I think I already said it, but make sure that you are customizing every resume based on the job you're applying to. So obviously you want to be truthful and factual, but sometimes it's the keywords that you could change over so it's sort of more customer curated for the job you're applying to. Another tip I always have is don't just regurgitate what your job duties are in the resume. A lot of people just put bullet points about what they have to do or what their expectations are. Employers are really looking for what you bring to the table and what contributions you've made. So make sure your statements are impact driven. So, if you do organize an event, don't just say I organized an event. It's like I leveraged my organizational skills to organize a 1,000-person event, and we did a survey, and it ended up being a super impactful event, and now we're going to host it annually. For example, I just made that up, but really trying to create more impact-driven statements and demonstrating what it is that you bring to the table and the success you've had in the specific roles you're doing. And then the last thing I would say with resumes is please don't have spelling mistakes. Just pay attention to detail, because that's an immediate turnoff. But really would encourage you to think beyond the resume and focus much more on other important job search strategies, especially networking. Which I know,
which we talked about a couple weeks ago, and there's a whole webinar on.
Ooh, baby, we have a full-on webinar. We talked about networking. If you log into your fully prepped account, you will see it under the resources section, and it's a free replay. You can watch it. While we're on the topic of resumes though, Julia, I'd like to talk about references. So we did have a question about that. It says, most companies need references. What kind of references are best when applying for jobs and why? And I think this is a very smart question, and I've never even thought of this. So I would love to learn more about this too.
Sure, yeah. So I was trying to think about sort of what the root of this question was, because if the person asking the question is concerned that they don't have previous job experience, then I would say get creative on who your references could be. So for example, if you volunteered, or if you play on a sports team, or you've been actively involved in your career center, or you helped your professor do some teaching assignments, or whatever the case may be, those are great references, because basically what employers are looking for is people that can, attest to your work capabilities, to your character, those kinds of things. They just want to validate that what you're saying to be true about yourself is in fact true. And so it does not necessarily have to be a previous employer. You can think about some creative ways of people who would be able to speak to sort of your background. But with respect to a professional resume, I would say definitely you would want to think about previous employers being your reference. If there were concerns, for example, there was some challenges in your previous employment relationship, I think you could also ask previous colleagues instead of necessarily your manager, anyone that's sort of worked with you and can speak to your background. It doesn't have to necessarily be your superior or where you previously worked. So don't feel limited by that. And more often than not, references, they're not often called, they're more there upon request. And so don't feel like you have to provide them. If employers want them, they'll ask you for them. So hopefully that helps.
And I want to jump a little bit into networking. I know we talked about it a lot in the first part 1 of the series, but I'd like to we had a lot of questions on it. So I kind of want to tackle it just very quickly, Meghan, if that's okay. So this one is a good one for anyone who is an introvert. So what tips would you recommend for a shy introvert for networking? How can they be successful in it? How about interviews? Any tips for anyone who's an introvert when it comes to networking and during the interview process?
So I think for both interviews and networking, the biggest piece of advice I'd have for introverts is to prepare yourself ahead of time. Specifically with networking, I think setting yourself a goal of, how many people do you want to try and connect with, whether that's, you're going to an event and your goal is I'm going to try and talk to 4 people at the event, or if it's in the job search and it's like I'm going to try and connect with 1 person a week. Setting a goal and trying to stick to it. And kind of preparing that goal ahead of time, I think, is really helpful. The other thing I'd say is thinking about when you're actually networking or in the interview. But if I start with networking, what is it that you want to talk about? So what questions might you ask somebody that you're meeting? What is it that you want to share about yourself? What are some questions that people might ask you, and could you prepare answers for those ahead of time? Because really, when you're talking about being an introvert, what it means is that you most naturally process ideas and information and emotions internally. An extrovert is the one who processes externally. They think about it and process as they talk about it out loud, like me answering this question, versus an introvert. So introverts can present themselves, whether it's public speaking or networking. They can be just as effective as an extrovert. It's just that time to process internally before it comes out of your mouth is really helpful. The other thing, and kind of along that same line of where you process thoughts and emotions, I would say be aware of your nonverbals, your body language, smiling, things like that. Make sure that you are smiling, that your arms aren't crossed, things like that. Another big one, I think, just with networking, and this kind of came up in our last webinar, is that it's really stressful and intimidating for a lot of people, introverted or extroverted. People are really shy and uncomfortable about networking. So if you are in a conference setting or an event setting, be aware that there's other people who are nervous or shy or introverted too. And just going up to one person and asking them, how are you? Or hi, nice to meet you. This is what my name is. Or have you been to this event before? Is really nice. It can be helpful to somebody else. It can also help you kind of potentially make a bit of a friend or a buddy that the two of you could network together at the event. And then I guess last but not least, be present in the conversation. And this does go for extroverts too, I guess. But sometimes when people get nervous about networking, they're just thinking like, what questions am I going to ask? What do I need to say next? As opposed to really taking the time to listen to what the other person is saying and being engaged and caring about what they have to say. Remember what they're talking about, be engaged with them. So that would be, I guess, my last piece of advice.
That's a very good point. I think if it's very transparent, if you have a hidden agenda and you're not actually listening to what someone's saying, the person picks up on that. And it's happened countless times to me where people are sort of trying to get to an end goal and are not really in an authentic conversation with me. So I really love that point. That's a great one.
Yeah,
even the authentic piece, I think that's, again, this isn't introvert specific, but networking isn't all about business and work. If there's something slightly personal that comes into it, like before this event started, the two of us were talking and maternity leave and children came up. That has, nothing to do with work or this webinar, but it's just a personal way of connecting with somebody, and that's great. And there's no problem with doing that at an event when you're networking either.
That's a great point. And I want to kind of touch on that. We had a question I'd love to talk about. Was it this one here? Okay, so it's related to HR, and I know, Julia, you have the experience obviously in HR, so maybe if you'd like to answer this one. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to find it. Okay, so I'm trying to move to a new city, but the type of role I want is in HR. Most organizations are hesitant to hire outside of their location for HR roles. Hopefully you can speak a little bit to that, Julia, because I'm not sure. How can I increase my visibility so that they see past the location?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I think the biggest concern with companies, especially in a cost-constrained environment right now, a lot of companies are struggling. The biggest concern is that they would not be able to be in a position to fund your move. And so I think it's really important that if you are trying to apply for a job that's not in your specific location, first of all, you need to think about, is that something you would want to financially support yourself? Or are you expecting the employer to cover it for you? And I will say, the employer will always sort of lean heavily towards finding talent within a local area that they don't have to pay to come. And so if you make that move on your own accord, that would be great. And I think it would serve well for your application. And I think it's important that you make mention of that when you are speaking to prospective employers. But I will say you will have a more difficult time if you're sort of applying to jobs in hopes that employers will relocate you, because that's just not, frankly, quite as common and not a position many employers are going to be in. So hopefully that helps. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add, like, if you have a family member or someone who lives in that location that you're moving to, again, if you are willing and able to relocate yourself, to use that address, if it is a place that you can go to physically or stay physically, if you were to need to move within the next 2 weeks, you can always use that address. The other thing I would say is, if you already know that you want to move to the specific city or specific town, COVID maybe is a good time to do that. If you do have a job where you're working remotely currently, you can work remotely from anywhere. So if you are employed currently, you could go make the move, especially if you know that you want to work in that city already.
That's a great point. The second half of this question also is about going from consulting back to a corporate environment. So hopefully, Julia, you could also expand on this one a little bit. So it also relates to being a stay-at-home mom for the first time. So I'll read the thing. So this is something I keep hearing mixed messages about. My experience, though, is based on considerable search time that it's really hard to get back into corporate. I took consulting roles to have flexibility with raising my child. Now my child is well past the age for me to accelerate in my career. My goal is a full-time job in corporate, and this is not opening for me to have after spending years in trying. I'm at a loss of what to do. So it sounds like they were working from home in order to raise their child, and now that their child is old enough, they're having trouble landing employment in a corporate environment.
Yeah, so it's a really great question. And without knowing the nuances of this specific situation, I'll try and answer it as generally as I can. But what I would say is there are some companies doing innovative things to help support women re-entering the workforce after taking time off from raising kids. Mm-hmm. And so definitely keep an eye out for that. I know RBC does that. So that's something to consider with respect to sort of acknowledging that you have a lot of great transferable skills. It's just sort of needing to re-enter and get refreshed on sort of being in a career. I also would say try and think about non-obvious opportunities or managing your expectations at maybe the level of seniority which you are able to re-enter. So, I just use my own personal example. I finished my MBA and the HR market was really dry. There was not a lot of great opportunities. And so I ended up taking a job as an EA to an HR executive. And I just got my foot in the door, proved my capabilities, and she ended up double promoting me within the year. And so sometimes it's also just trying to get your foot in the door, taking opportunities that might not seem optimal at the time, but recognizing it's a way to get into the corporation, get your bearings about yourself again, learn sort of different skills and capabilities you might need to excel in roles. Like, a lot is changing at an accelerated pace too. So figuring out what your gaps are and how you could be working on those to help fill those gaps. So yeah, those are kind of my main pieces of advice. I don't know, Meghan, if you have anything you'd add on your end.
Yeah. I have worked with a lot of women and individuals who have re-entered after years out of the workforce. I would say probably the biggest challenge I see is confidence or lacking confidence once you've been out of that full-time workforce. But if this individual has been consulting, I would say, what are the companies you've been consulting with? Who are those relationships with? Because if they know your skills and what you bring to the table, even if it wasn't on a full-time basis, that could be a place to start. They could recommend you. That's probably what comes to mind right away for me, is leverage your network.
Yeah, and the confidence piece, you can't underestimate. Like, employers want to hire someone that believes in themselves so they can believe in you. And if you can't convey that confidence, then, it's not likely it will translate to an employer. So I think that inner work is super important.
And going back, I guess, to something I said earlier with that question about being underqualified is own that you have a mat leave, because in a cover letter, that's where you can really address any potential gaps. If you're worried the employer is going to look at my resume and go, oh my gosh, why haven't you been working for the last 3 years? Well, explain in a cover letter, because if you tell me I was raising children, I'm now ready to re-enter the workforce, it's not a gap anymore. It's like, oh, okay, of course you were. Now here you come back. Great.
Yeah, I think it's being unapologetic about your life choices is important, because it's you just being authentic and owning your story. And I think companies would respect that and respond to it.
So Meghan, you would suggest putting a maternity gap in a cover letter? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't think you would necessarily. I mean, I have seen it written into a resume, but when I see a cover letter, I like it to explain. Like, I want to know what you're applying to, why you're applying to it, what skills you bring to the table, or kind of like Julia was talking about earlier, kind of making sure you're addressing those keywords in the posting in your cover letter. But I also like an explanation of, why do you want the job? Is it something specific about the role, the company, and something unique and nuanced, not just like, so I can apply my skills in a new industry. Like, that's too vague. Like, anybody can say that. Tell me something specific, and then address something like that. If there is a gap, like a mat leave, or you're taking care of an ill parent, or you moved overseas, or there's different types of gaps, right? Like, sometimes it's a time gap, sometimes it's you've moved through a lot of different companies quickly, and rather than just hoping nobody notices it, I think you should address it head on and explain why it is the way it is.
Yeah, I love that. So we just have a few more minutes left. I'd love to jump into the questions that were submitted throughout the webinar. This was a great one from Alexander. So, do you think it's too late to change careers or change companies if I'm already 48 years old, as companies might prefer the younger ones?
Oh, I want to jump all over that one.
Me too.
No, you are not too old. My average client is mid to late 30s. Half the time they think that they are too old. I always look at it and say, how much time do you have left in your career? Most Canadians now will work till they're 65. So I look at that. You've got well over a decade left. The other thing with newer generations or younger generations, they do tend to move around more quickly. 1 year here, 2 years here. If you're somebody who, yes, you're 48, but you anticipate only making 1 or 2 more career moves for the rest of your career, you could be a more valuable asset. So I think it's all about how you market yourself and how you present yourself. Sometimes older clients, and I don't think 48 is particularly old, so I'm thinking specifically when I get more to late 50s, you need to present like fresh, young. So what do you look like? Make sure you have a fresh haircut. Are you wearing a suit that was made in the 80s, or do you have something that's a bit more modern? Like, put yourself together in a polished way when you're presenting yourself.
I also just add, I think like it's super important to project an appetite or a thirst for like learning and evolution. I think companies are just super keen to have someone who's hungry to learn and adapt. A lot of people can be so resistant to change. And so regardless of what age you're at, if you're willing to sort of upskill yourself and being open to trying new things or starting over in some capacities, it could only open your opportunities.
Yeah, I'd like to point out too, Alexander, we actually have a lot of blog articles on how to upskill. So if you're interested in upskilling from home, we have so many articles on our blog on how you can do that. And we also hosted a webinar a couple months ago on how to build your personal brand. So if you log into your Prepped account under the webinars, you'll be able to see a recording about how you can build your personal brand and help you on your job search. I have one from Zoe, and I think this one's also an incredible, they're all amazing questions, but this one really stood out to me personally. Can coffee chats lead to rejection in an interview? I recently had a coffee chat that ended up getting rejected by the same person in the application process. Should I treat coffee chats as interviews in the future? Julia, would you like to tackle this one?
Yes. So basically, what I'm interpreting is that you had applied for a job and they booked you for a coffee chat to discuss the posting. And in that case, I would have absolutely always treated it as an interview. I think people are becoming a little bit more, I don't want to say casual, but, it's not as much of a crusty formal process anymore. As we talked about at the beginning, Meghan and I were sharing about motherhood and mat leave. And so I think people are trying to bring more of their authentic selves to work. But I never want that to be confused with the fact that they aren't also trying to have sussed out if you would be an appropriate candidate. But, I would take it a step further and say every time you're networking with someone, always treat it as a job interview, essentially, because, if you're putting yourself out there, making your aspiration known, people remember what it is you're looking for. I know I personally, if I am impressed with someone I've had coffee with, they're always percolating in my mind. And when I have a job opening or a friend of mine in the organization has a job opening, I'll be quick to refer them. And so, making sure you're making a good impression and treating every single one like a job interview can only bode well for your future opportunities.
I actually took that question the other way, where maybe they had a coffee chat with someone first and then applied to a job but got rejected.
Oh, okay.
That might not be the case. If it is, if you did have good rapport with the individual, you could follow up and ask why you were rejected. They may not share the answer with you, but perhaps you were a great candidate. There were just a lot of stronger candidates than you out there.
Yeah, I would always, regardless of whether you know them or not, I always would recommend following up with an interview or a recruiter or an interviewee if you haven't been successful, and if you come from it a lens of personal improvement and personal development, I think people are more often than not really willing to share why you weren't selected. And I think it can help you sort of continuously improve and potentially better prepare for your next opportunity or interview. So don't be shy about reaching back out and asking. In fact, I think I've heard stories where people ask why they weren't selected for an interview and then ended up moving forward for a different job in the organization. So again, you never know where things can lead sometimes.
Put yourself out there.
Yeah. And so we're just at time. So I'd like to have one more question. And I've saved this one for last because I thought this one was a great way to end the webinar. With the current times with the pandemic, a lot of us are working from home, and a lot of us may be looking to do a career pivot or just looking to get into any specific industry at this point. So Meghan, I'll start with you, and then I'd love to get your input on this as well. Julia, do you have any strategies for making a job switch during the next few years of global and economic uncertainty?
It's funny because with that question, I think a lot of my advice would be very similar, whether we were in a challenging economic time or not. I think specifically because competition could be a little bit higher, I think being really clear about what you're looking for. And when I say clear, I mean specific, not just, oh, I'm looking for a marketing job. Be more specific about what type of job, what industry, what type of focus do you want to have, those sorts of things, what type of work environment, what size of company, those would also be important. The other thing I think is, and this kind of goes back to Julia's comment about resumes, being able to speak to how you can add value. And what makes you unique from other people who are applying to the same job. So I think it really does come down to much stronger and more strategic personal branding. The other thing, and this is just kind of a separate piece of advice, I guess, would be to consider a portfolio career. A lot of the time when people are thinking about career, they're really just one track. What is the thing I should be doing? And more, I'm having a number of clients who have a portfolio career where they have a number of kind of different income or revenue streams, so that if there is uncertainty, if something doesn't work out, that there's always another option there. It's kind of, it's in another way having a backup plan, which is important, but a portfolio career where it's diversifying what you're putting out there and how you're being paid.
Love that. I actually don't have too much more to add, but and I know we're over time, so I want to be respectful of that. Marley, I'm seeing so many good questions come in. So what I'd love to commit to everyone is potentially we can do sort of a follow-up email where Meghan and I will answer any of the outstanding questions, so that way everyone feels like they got their opportunity to hear from us. And so we'll be sure to follow up with that, I think, Marley and Meghan, if we can commit to that and help answer those questions. And we'll share it with everyone so everyone can have an insight into that. But I just want to thank Meghan, because your expertise is incredible, and we're very lucky to have you joining, and this was a huge gift that you gave our users, so thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I'm a talker, so I'm always happy to give my opinion. And I think what you do at Prepped is awesome, super useful, and something that'll definitely refer my clients to. It sounds like you've got a lot of really useful resources and blogs that would benefit a lot of the people I talk to.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And thank you for hosting, Marley.
Of course. So for everybody on the line, thank you so much for taking the time to join today's webinar for part 1 and part 2 if you were attending. Big thank you to Meghan and Julia for joining us. I think we've all learned a lot of useful tips. I know I have. So if anybody on the line has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@fullyprepped.ca. We love hearing from you. We love helping you and supporting you during your job search. And we will follow up with any questions that have been unanswered, so no hesitation there. So thank you guys so much. Sorry we're 4 minutes over time, but I hope you have a wonderful day and take care.
Bye.
Thank you.